The World Economic Forum wrapped up in Davos over the weekend after days of woke preaching and unhinged ranting from the richest, most privileged people on the earth. Now, if the World Economic Forum elite really wanted to save the world or alleviate suffering, wouldn't they focus on the number of people dying from malnutrition, from preventable illnesses? Wouldn't they focus on tackling the mega threats of rocketing inflation, global supply shortages and the risks of hyperglobalisation? Sees families paying thousands of pounds just to heat their homes. And it's causing so much hardship that people are now having to choose between heating and eating. Some policy experts lay the blame at the government's net zero targets, which are forcing people off cheap gas so the government can meet arbitrary climate targets. But when asked about the cost of living squeeze by GB News presenter Calvin Robinson, the climate guru Greta Thunberg thought it was all a big joke.
Every time a Western government implements a net zero policy, it's common folk that are suffering, especially in a cost of living crisis. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, it's horrible that people are being affected by different things, like example, the climate crisis and so on. People are being displaced and losing their lives. It's horrible.
But they can't afford to eat or heat their homes because of the net zero policies.
Yeah, that's definitely why we are experiencing the cost of living crisis, yes.
I agree. Thank you.
Here to discuss that and much more is author of Fossil Future, Alex Epstein. Alex, what have we made of the World Economic Forum?
Basically, the World Economic Forum should really be engaging in a giant global apology right now, because it is, you mentioned mega threats and the economy. And if you look at the global supply chain crisis, inflation, energy shortages, these are all caused substantially by what the World Economic Forum has been advocating. I mean, it's really the World Anti-Freedom Forum, because it's saying we shouldn't have freedom. And so the reaction to a new virus is just to suppress freedom wherever you can, which obviously that depresses productivity, which increases inflation. This should be obvious. And then in particular, they're against the freedom to use fossil fuels, which is the whole basis of the global economy. So they've made energy artificially scarce. And instead of just fessing up and saying, hey, we screwed up, it should be obvious as economists, if we're economists, that we need freedom and we need fossil fuels, because those are the things that have actually created economic prosperity and really brought us out of primitive, impoverished times. They continue to just act like everything they've been doing is right in terms of catastrophizing climate and saying the solution is to restrict freedom even more, particularly the freedom to use fossil fuels. And then Greta is a perfect example of this idiocy, because it cannot even, she's interacted with all these so-called smart people, and it doesn't occur to her that suppressing the supply of fossil fuels might have caused the increase in the price of fossil fuels. So it's not her fault, although she is getting older, so it's starting to be her fault. It's the idiocy of the World Economic Forum that she can't even understand supply and demand of fossil fuels and why that might be a problem for poor people, which is not her.
Well, I mean, it's the fault of our idiotic politicians, because they're listening to a teenager and they're allowing her to influence policy, and it is causing such resounding hardship for people, and not just the poorest, because, well, we know they suffer the most when energy prices go up, but we've got people who are never before suffered with this issue being plunged into climate poverty and, energy poverty, but caused by climate change. Now, I've got to ask you about some of the unhinged claims we've seen at the World Economic Forum. And these claims are presented as fact. They go unquestioned. And not just from nobodies. We're talking about the likes of John Kerry and Al Gore. Let's have a look.
You look at what's happening with species. Half the species of the planet have been already killed.
And melting the ice and raising the sea level and causing these waves of climate refugees predicted to reach 1 billion in this century.
Just insane stuff. Half the species have been already lost, and we're going to have boiling seas and 1 billion climate refugees. Where is the debate at Davos? Where's the critical thinking? And what's even the point of having this annual event?
Well, I mean, I think yeah, I mean, I think the thing should be abolished unless they apologize. But I mean, if you're the organization that's more wrong than anyone else, nobody should be flying private jets there or doing anything else there. So, I mean, the whole thing should be canceled and everyone involved should be discredited, certainly the leadership. And I'm going to keep working to make sure that happens. And, Kerry and Gore, what they show is really where Greta gets her mentality, because notice they attribute no benefits to fossil fuels, even though those power the world, including allow us to be safer from climate than ever. And they have this bizarre pseudoscientific, primitive religious view of CO2 emissions. It's like, we emit CO2, it has a warming effect, it has a greening effect, the world becomes a little bit more tropical slowly over time. How does that make half the species extinct, which is a totally made up, distorted number? Or how is that going to make everything boil? Or how is it going to ruin the world, given that more people die of cold than of heat and people tend to want to move to warmer regions? It makes no sense unless you just have this very deep hostility toward all industry and all human impact, where you think any little impact is going to ruin everything and you can see no good in all the impact that we've done, even though that's made the world livable, to the point where these old guys are even alive to lecture us and destroy the next generation.
Absolutely. Let's actually get a stat from a real scientist, Bjorn Lomborg, who has written climate-related disasters killed fewer people in 2022, 97.6% less than a century ago. So this is the argument that you make, Alex, that richer and more resilient societies reduce disaster deaths, and we should be trying to make the whole world as prosperous and as privileged as we are, instead of trying to impoverish ourselves. Now, I've got to ask you about Greta as well, because before her antics at the World Economic Forum or at Davos, she was getting arrested in Germany. I mean, a lot of people are saying this arrest was staged. It certainly was the friendliest arrest I've seen German police make.
Again, Greta is just the perfect product of our miseducation system, because she can see no benefit in fossil fuels, and she can only see this bizarre catastrophe supposedly emerging from changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03% to 0.04%. I mean, here's a question for you, Rita, and everyone else. How many times, with all the climate, quote, news that we hear, did anyone hear in the newspapers that climate-related deaths were at an all-time low? Wouldn't that be relevant news?
Yeah.
I didn't see one headline about this.
Well, exactly. We don't hear that. And we've got kids, Greta's age and younger, who've got suffering from climate anxiety because they think that the world's ending. They think their families are going to perish because of climate change, and they don't actually hear the data. And it really is just, I think, a moment of madness for the world. I wonder in 100 years, 200 years, what people will think when they look back at this period and how we behaved and the mass hysteria that was around this topic.
I think they'll see it like we see past things like the Mayan apocalypse of 2012, right? It's a primitive religious cult making doomsday predictions based on a total non-understanding of how the world works. I mean, it's pretty clear fossil fuels make the world livable by allowing us to use machines to be productive and prosperous, including to keep ourselves amazingly safe from climate disasters, and that making the world a little bit warmer and significantly greener is not a catastrophe and is certainly not worth ruining billions of lives. And also, of course, they would say this is bizarre that we don't look into things like nuclear power. And of course, look at Australia banning it and claiming to care about CO2. So I think they will see it as this primitive, anti-human religious cult.
Alex Epstein, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for joining me today.